South Africa's land distribution program is faltering. There's now concerns that negative perceptions about the program, and those are growing among the country's citizens. The program remains far behind schedule in reaching its threshold of redistributing at least 30% of land back to black hands. Let's discuss this further. We're joined by Setou from the Vumelana Advisory Fund. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. And maybe let's start with a broad description of the major concerns around the land distribution program and why so many people are skeptical around its ability to redistribute land back to black hands, as I've just introed.
Good morning, Rafio, and good morning to your listeners. I think the issue of land redistribution remains a sore point for the majority of South Africans. And you actually highlighted the fact that there's a negative perception out there, especially among South Africans, that not much has really been achieved in terms of distributing land to, black South Africans. We must remember that land redistribution or land reform, as it were, is a constitutional imperative. The South African Constitution enjoins government to implement specific measures to ensure that land reform can actually happen in a more sustainable fashion, and then that we can begin to address some of the mistakes of the past. Now, one of the challenges that we are really facing as a country is this whole notion of not really having a common vision in terms of what is it that land reform has achieved to date. For example, you've mentioned the whole issue around the redistributing about 30% of lands, of the land which was in white hands, to black South Africans. The government did an audit between 2010 and 2017, which amongst others concluded that very limited has actually happened in that regard, i.e. that between 8 and 10% of the land that was in white hands has subsequently been transferred to black hands. Now, there are also other industry players who actually differ with this conclusion. For example, Wandile Sihlobo, representing Agricultural Business Chamber, as well as Professor Kirsten from the Bureau for Market Economic Research, they've actually argued that the lack of a common understanding about the country's land and agriculture has fueled this belief that about 30 years into our democracy, only 8 to 10% of the land has been transferred. And they argue that based on their own research, about 24% of farmland has actually been redistributed. Now you can see that clearly there are these differences of opinion. I mean, AgriSA also did their own land audit in 2017, which also arrived at somewhat different conclusion, which painted a somewhat different picture. Now, as a nation, if we are to move forward, we need to know first and foremost, where are we in terms of redistributing land to black South Africans, so that we can set clear targets and agree and have a common vision as a nation to say, this is where we are and this is where we would like to be into the future. And we can measure those targets.
Yeah, but how do we begin to do that? Because one would think that there needs to be 100% political will to make sure that we get a clearer picture of where we are at the moment. And that would essentially mean that government partnering with various stakeholders, like you've mentioned, AgriSA, for example, to get a sense of where exactly we are and the targets that we'd like to be meeting. So once we do that, what would those targets look like?
Well, I think as a starting point, we need to first and foremost agree on how we need to go about ensuring that we've got a common vision. Government needs to set up, clear technical standards, including field surveys and data processing mechanisms and data exchange according to international standards. I mean, the United Nations, somewhere around 1996, published some of the guidelines, which I think would be useful so that we don't reinvent the wheel as a country. At least we've got somewhere where to start. And this process, in my view, should, as far as possible, be an inclusive process. Government can't do it alone. You need the involvement of academics, organizations such as ourselves. You need industry players also to come on board. so that we can reach consensus around the measures, on land redistribution, and specifically how much land has already been transferred. And as I've said, those broader measures should, amongst others, include things like the value of such land, the potential of such land, rather than only the land size and hectares alone, because I think this really skews the whole picture. We need to get a much more balanced perspective on progress that we have made today. In that way, we'll have a much more common vision, and we'll be able to move in unison in terms of identifying what are the challenges, how can we address those challenges, and where we want to be, for example, in the next 10 years or so.
Let's speak about the potential of land as opposed to just the size of the land. There are conversations that include concerns that if we are seeing a redistribution program where land is going back into the hands of black people, there might be a skills deficit, because one of the things that we want to do with the land redistribution program is to ensure food security, and the agricultural component may be at risk based on the skills deficit that may or may not exist at the moment when it comes to agriculture and people having land on which to farm. How do we address those concerns if they do exist, and what kind of programs do you think should be initiated to make sure that as we redistribute land, it works in conjunction to those knowing that this is how to take advantage of the potential of this land?
I think you're raising a very important point to say what happens once the land has been transferred or land is in the hands of our people. The reality is, as we speak now, in close to 10 million hectares have already been distributed to South Africans through either a land restitution or land redistribution. But the reality is, a lot of such land parcels remain unproductive. Now, there is an expectation that government must fund all these programs, including upskilling our people. It is well nigh impossible for government to actually achieve this on its own. It is important that government has to partner with civil society, with the private sector, organizations such as ourselves, in order to ensure that we can address issues around, first and foremost, access to finance, ensuring that our people have got the requisite skill set so that they can, work the land. And most importantly, that they've got access to markets, because it's one thing to work the land. If you don't have access to markets, it really doesn't work for you. There is a growing body of evidence that partnerships are really critical for sustainable land reform, and government, as I've said, on its own can't do this. Our own work as Vumelana can bear testimony to that. Since our inception about 10 years ago or so, we have managed to conclude about 26 projects which have mobilized in excess of R1 billion in private capital, and putting into productive use in excess of 72,000 hectares. Now, just for a moment, if you were to imagine, if we were to rely on government, I think this bears testimony to the fact that if you bring the private sector, who have got access to capital, who have the requisite skills into the equation, and they partner with the communities, in that way, we can actually address some of the challenges that we are seeing in the land reform space. It is important that we need to do that at scale. I mean, as an organization, there is just so much that we can do. But if we can start doing that at scale, I think we can begin to address the issues that you are referring to around, for example, the skills deficit. Because over a period, you engage and make sure that our people get involved in some of these programs. And over time, they gain the skills, they understand how the businesses run, etc. And they build a history so that into the future, they can actually have access to finance from your formal financial institutions, which is really a problem at this stage, because the issue of access to finance and productive finance, for that matter, is one of the key challenges that we've got to address as a country.
And just as a final thought from you, as we address those challenges as you have described, are you confident that if there is what you have described, a partnership between government and private and related stakeholders, we will be able to reach that target that has now been set by government of redistributing that 30% of over 120 million hectares of land by 2030? Do you foresee this being a feasible target that has now been moved by government?
Well, my view of you is that this is an achievable target, but we need to start somewhere. We need to start off by really having a common understanding in terms of where are we. As I've indicated, some of the commentators or some of the industry experts are already arguing that we're actually not far off the mark from the 30% that government has set as a target. They argue that if you look at some of the land that was actually acquired through private means, we easily hit around 24%. Now, obviously, that's their view. So I'm arguing that perhaps we need a more, collaborative effort so that we can come up with a process that is inclusive, that addresses everything, that everybody can buy into. And then in that way, we will be able to sort of agree on where are we, also where is it that we want to be. And most importantly, finally, is to also agree that will help us to really work as in unison with the private sector, with non-profit organizations and communities as well, so that we can address some of the challenges, because we really need to address some of these challenges in an integrated manner.
Thank you very much for those insights, Mr. Peter Setou from the Vumelana Advisory Fund, speaking about the redistribution of about 30% of over 120 million hectares of land in South Africa, saying that those targets are feasible, they are reachable by 2030 if government is willing to work closely with organizations like themselves and other private entities operating in the land distribution space in the country.